Good evening, or good morning, or good afternoon, whatever time it is you're hailing from. I'm Chantal Hale, the IT Masters CEO, and I'm here with Dr. George Thomas for week 2 of the CompTIA Security Plus short course. Um, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. So welcome to everybody. For those of you who have never sat one of these short courses before, if this is your first week, the first webinar for this short course is up on YouTube or on the learn.itmasters.edu.au website that you should get by registering for the short course, which I assume all of you are. But if you haven't heard of us, IT Masters is an online education organisation offering IT postgraduate qualifications with IT industry knowledge embedded in them in conjunction with Charles Sturt University. So this course is based not only on the CompTIA Security Plus certification, but also we have an IT Masters subject, ITI 581 Cybersecurity Fundamentals, that relates to it. And if you complete that industry certification, so not this short course, but the industry certification, you could be eligible for credit for that subject. I might talk a little bit more about those courses later, but for now, I'm going to hand you over to Dr. George Thomas, who I did the full introduction to last week, and I don't think he wants me to go over all of his certifications again, but rest assured he's very capable and he's going to cover the second week of this course.
Thanks, Chantal. Yeah, no need to do another introduction for me. So welcome back to week 2 of the CompTIA Security Plus short course. I think just before we jumped on the webinar, one thing that I wanted to kind of flag is that there's this is a short course. It goes for 4 weeks. We sort of we're together for an hour or so, and we try and cover off as much as we can. Now, there is probably more content. I think if you look at the entire course, we definitely can't cram every single piece in the space of, you know, four, what, 1 and a bit hour sessions. But I think it's definitely a good place to kind of get started and to build knowledge, and it will definitely be valuable for anyone that is going to go and sit the Security Plus exam. But definitely there'd be benefits to, either doing, sorry, what was it? ITE 581.
ITI 581. Yeah.
ITI. There you go. I feel like there's ITIs and ITCs. I was close, at least I got the IT part right. Um, and obviously there's additional course material available. But again, there's other things you can do is you can ask questions and so forth, and we'll try and get to those. And there's also the forums in the learning portal as well. So anyway, I should spend less time talking about that, one more time going through the content. So what is going on with my mouse? There we go. So last week we did a very a sort of high level introduction to Security Plus, to CompTIA, and started on the security fundamentals and talking about some of that stuff. And today we're going to talk about compliance and operational security. So, and apologies, I feel like I'm getting a cold or something. So yeah, if I have to pause momentarily to, sneeze or whatever, then I apologize for that. So today, security governance concepts. So what we'll do is we'll take a look at security governance concepts and sort of break those down. And I think the best place to start is with the good old policies. So policies are an essential part of security governance. Now, what they do is they define the rules that an organization must follow, and they are, enforceable, when you think about an organization. So they need to be formalized, they need to be approved, they need to be approved at a senior management level. Otherwise, if they're not, it's going to be very hard to enforce them. So, I guess when a policy is developed, it needs to be obviously complete, but it needs to be approved by senior leadership. So you need to get that buy-in. That we talk about this top-down approach, so that it cascades down to the rest of the organization. And it's really vital that this is done as part of effective governance. And so I like to think of policies as the why. So what they do is their policies are typically not very technical. They need to be understandable by many audiences. So again, try and refrain from a lot of technical information in a policy. They have to align, or they should align, to the organization or the business's, mission, goals, values, um, and they really drive culture. And so, as I said, at the top of and when we think about, I always think about like a pyramid. Policies are that overarching why, like, um, why are we doing this? And as I said, and there needs to be that alignment. And so, again, this is not an exhaustive list of policies. These are just some common policies. I do a lot of work in ISO 27001. So that's the Information Security Management Standard. And definitely the first two policies that I will start with in any organization, whether I'm auditing an organization or whether I'm doing an implementation piece, are the acceptable use policy and the information security policies. And so the acceptable use policy really provides the directives and rules around how a user, what is the acceptable use of systems. And so, that would be things like prohibiting inappropriate or illegal activity. There may be things around using only sanctioned applications. There's all sorts of things, and it will differ from organization to organization. Um, the second part is the information security policies. Again, I do a lot of work in ISO, but that would typically be aligned to the requirements of information security, such as things like access control, network security, requiring the use of encryption. Again, there's no right or wrong. It comes down to each and every organization, but something that's very important. And aside from that approval by, senior management slash leadership, acknowledgement. So there's that, and then there's distribution and making sure people are informed about these policies, followed by, some sort of acknowledgement. So we see that often, I mean, some organizations get people to sign the policies, but often you see like login banners and things like that. So you log into a system and it says by logging in and accessing these network services, you agree to abide by. It's also contained a lot of employment agreements, you agree to abide by policies, and those sorts of things. There are some other policies in here that may be very specific. So for example, you see the software development lifecycle policy that may not be necessarily intended for every audience. That may be only for those that do software development. But again, there needs to be some set of rules that govern how, I guess, govern how things are done in terms of like what the requirements are. And similarly, we've got disaster recovery, incident response, change management, which we'll get into in a little bit later. So in a few more slides, we'll talk about change management, and then business continuity and so forth. So definitely a lot of policies there. Again, not an exhaustive list. I've seen others. I've seen like cloud computing policies. I'm now starting to see a lot of policies around emerging technologies. So trying to provide some governance around things like artificial intelligence and so forth. So not so much quantum computing yet, but yeah, definitely depends on an organization and what their needs are. But yeah, these are just some common ones. Um, so I think the other thing, as I mentioned with policies, is they need to be, especially things like acceptable use and information security policies, which will typically be provided to every individual, or sometimes not even folks within the organization. Sometimes it may be externals. Sometimes policies are provided to suppliers and business partners, contractors, and things like that. They need to be written in a way that folks understand them. So that use of like layman and avoiding jargon and sort of very technical terms, which is why, as I said before, there's the use of technical elements should be avoided within a policy. And when I think about how policies are written, and don't worry, I don't think you're going to get asked this on the exam. There's usually directives. So, shall, as in encryption shall be used to protect information, could be a must, similar, or a, should or should not. So something a bit more optional. So, what's an example of a should? You should not use public Wi-Fi if possible. So those types of terms. So be very, very clear. Um, cool. So some guidelines on developing policies. Um, so there's recommendations that steer actions in a particular job, role, or department. So again, as I said, when we look at the secure development policy, that is for generally a particular role or team. So e.g. those folks that develop. There's no point sending or having that communicated to a user that is just an end user or a frontline worker if they don't do that. So, there are some, some thoughts around that. And then also allowing things like, the sort of flexibility and stuff like that. So we'll go on to procedures. Procedures I like to describe as the how. So these are like those step-by-step instructions. How is something done? So while a policy will say, as an example, encryption shall be used to protect information at rest and in transit, a procedure will describe how that is achieved. As a rule of thumb, I typically will make sure the procedures develop for things that are complex, maybe not necessarily everything. But a good example is, user creation. Maybe there's a process for creating a user accounts, and maybe it requires a bunch of things to do, like turn on MFA, so turn on multi-factor authentication, add to particular groups, and so forth. And so, to make sure that that is done consistently and that things aren't skipped, then it may be beneficial to have a procedure that does that. And I guess it kind of says there, ensure that task is completed in a compliant and repeatable way. And so you got things here, examples, so onboarding, offboarding, which is the one I just used, conducting background checks, patching. Again, if you look at things like patching, part of that may be, okay, you identified that there's a patch, you'll need to go log a change request, and we'll talk about change. And then, as part of that, there's the process to be followed, whether you do that in your patch management tool and how you go about approving and how you go about rolling back, like having that procedural document. And that can be really useful, especially, as I said, in complex scenarios, because what you don't want is to have a situation where, you're under pressure to do something and something goes wrong and you have to quickly work out how to do it. So if you've got a clear procedure on how to do it, it lessens the risk. So yeah, procedures are really important. There is the other element in there. It talks about playbooks. So these are playbooks are again instructions that can be used, for example, in security operations. So in the event that an incident has happened, let's say that there's a ransomware incident that's happened, having a playbook that has clear steps on what to do in the event that something like that happens is going to be very beneficial to the organization. So again, it's not a case of scrambling to try and work out what to do, because stuff like that isn't, well, hopefully, isn't going to happen on a day-to-day basis. So, in the event that an incident occurs, being able to respond and having playbooks for those common things. At the moment, it's stuff like business email compromise, it's stuff like ransomware. Having a set of clear instructions on how to respond is important. So, what's happened? And then you've got standards. So standards and regulations kind of can work hand in hand. So regulations will mandate that the details in a standard must be used. And again, when I think of that pyramid, the standard for me is a bit like the what. And so we can see industry standards here as an example. So the ISO 27000 series, so Information Security Management System, which is so ISO being the International Organization for Standardization. Yes, I'm aware that it's iOS, but it's ISO. Um, they have a set of standards. Now, again, ISO 27001 is the information security set of standards, and there's a whole bunch of standards in there. So 27001 being the certifiable ISMS, 27701 being the privacy information management system standard. There's also other standards that are not as relevant. So, and I don't think you have to worry about these, but ISO 9001 around quality, ISO 45001 around occupational health and safety and things like that. So there's heaps of them. But when we talk about information security and, for the purposes of Security Plus, the 27,000 series is definitely one to be aware of. NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, they have a series of publications. So you'll see them as NIST SP, so NIST Special Publication, and usually 800, and then a number. So you'll see 800-37 being risk management standards and frameworks. You'll see 853. You'll also see the cybersecurity framework as part of the NIST series. So from the US Department of Commerce and NIST. PCI being the payment card industry data security standard. So we're just currently in the sort of throes of compliance with PCI DSS 4, which is the new standard that came out, I think, around March last year. So prior to that, 3.2.1. FIPS is a Federal Information Processing Standard, so that's a US one as well, and there's plenty others. As you can see here, these really focus on the international and US standards. And that's probably worthwhile noting, especially when I skip to the next page or maybe the one after on legal requirements. There's also the concept of internal standards. So here you'll see the example of encryption. So encryption, I've talked about a little bit. Having an internal standard around encryption is kind of focused on saying, well, we need to, as sort of for information or data shall be encrypted when in transit and in rest. And what the standard will do, so the encryption standard, is it will provide requirements on how to standardize that. So, for example, standardizing encryption to say, it will be AES 256 bit, as an example. The key size will be this. Keys shall be rotated at this interval. That would be contained within a standard. So this is where you're going to see a lot more of that technical information is within the standard versus, in the policy. So if you think about that hierarchy, you've got policy, thou shalt encrypt stuff, standard, thou shalt encrypt stuff using this particular set of algorithms, ciphers, etc. And then procedure, and this is how you shall do it. So that's kind of how it all kind of links together. You often see other, and it's not really talked about here, but you'll see baselines and guidelines and things like that. Guidelines being more around suggestions is not the right word, but kind of how things should be done. As in, when you're doing this, use this as a guide, use these as guidelines. They tend to be less mandatory. So, yeah, I'm not really going to talk about guidelines, but cool. Legal environment. So the law. Interestingly, I use legal requirements a lot to get things done. Because at the end of the day, like you need to comply with applicable laws. And for any law or regulation, they could easily be located using the search engine. So if you sit there and say, okay, well, I'm in a certain jurisdiction, so I'm in Australia, and what is the privacy law in Australia? So Privacy Act 1988, right? So now, depending on jurisdiction, that will change. If you're in the European Union, it's going to be EU GDPR. If you're in Canada, I think it's PIPEDA. It's going to vary. If you're in the US, it's going to be a little interesting because it depends where you are. So, for example, if you're in California, it's going to be different from whether if you're in Wyoming. Now, again, there's going to be considerations around where you operate as well. So, a good example is even if you're based in Australia, but you're providing services or goods to individuals in the European Union, then there may be implications around GDPR. But again, as I said, that is something that can be easily found using a search engine or going to the particular government site. So, for example, if you go to in Australia, if you go to the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, or you go to legislation.gov.au, you can pull down this information if you so wish and decide you want to go and read it. One thing I will say is that knowledge of the specific elements within those laws is not needed for the exam. So that I'm very sure about. So it's not going to specifically, and I know this, I mean, I literally probably 4 weeks ago sat the SIPM exam, which is the privacy manager exam. That one obviously is very focused on privacy and there was a lot more depth. This is not going to do that. So, here it's going to be a case of, knowing that these laws exist. So knowing, for example, that there is the GDPR, that, it's for the European Union, but it's not going to say, well, what is Article 31? Don't worry about that. So obviously in practice, you might need to know that, but for the purposes of the exam, you can not worry about the nitty gritty of what's in each of those pieces of legislation or regulation. And so if I look at the legal environment here are some examples of some of the laws and regulations from around the globe. These are the ones I think that are called out in Security Plus. So you will notice that there's probably none in there that talk about Australia. I mean, to be honest, if it does get asked, Privacy Act 1988, it's probably one. So in terms of, privacy, what have we got? We have the GDPR, so the General Data Protection Regulation, which is the EU regulation. CCPA doesn't say that, but that's the California Consumer Privacy Act, I think it is. I think that's what it stands for, which is for California specifically, and it says many others, and there are many others. But those are some of the key ones. There's some stuff there around, critical infrastructure. You could see like COPPA, so around online privacy, children's online privacy. There's heaps of them. HIPAA is a big one. So again, probably useful to know what these are, but not the detail. So for example, if there's a question hypothetically around the, the use of personal health information or e-personal health information. So you probably see like EPHI in the United States, then HIPAA may be a relevant piece of legislation to deal with that. PCI DSS is specifically around organizations that collect and process credit card information, and etc. So just be kind of aware that these exist. I'm going to pause for a minute, have some water, and we're going to jump
And
into
I was going to
education.
say, before you move on, we do have some questions that are related to this, and I thought it might be nice to ask them now. Eric was asking, with laws and regulations, do you go off which country the company is based in or where the servers are stored?
Well, that's definitely going to be one for a lawyer, not me. Um, so not advice. Let's go with that. Um, I always do that. This is not legal advice. Also, not medical advice, if relevant. Not that type of doctor, but it depends usually. So, I mean, I've done a lot in that space, and usually it's a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B. So, and I'll use the example of there's been situations where I've had to provision cloud services or take on cloud services for an organization. Let's say the organization is based in Australia and they want to take on a cloud service. And there has been a big case about this. Actually, there was that whole, what was it, like Microsoft versus the EU type of thing going on, where if the infrastructure resides in the US, so in an overseas jurisdiction, and we will talk about jurisdictions, especially because the last section of this is around privacy. Um, and but the client or the data that's on there is Australian based, then there may be implications because if that system resides, for example, in the US, then it may be subject to something like the USA Patriot Act. In which case that may have implications from a potential privacy perspective for the individuals whose information is stored in there who belong to a different jurisdiction. So, it's a bit of a tricky one. That was like the other one I said before about the EU. So if you are, in Australia, but you're providing services to individuals in the EU, then there will likely be implications around that because you'll need to comply with EU GDPR. Even though it's all over here, but you're providing services to over there. So it really does depend. And a good example with Privacy Act is, there's this concept which I don't think you need to know about, but I'll tell you anyway, called PIA, Privacy Impact Assessment. And what that does is it looks at how information is used, what jurisdictions it's going to be used in, what laws are applicable, and how those laws impact the privacy of those individuals, because it will vary. So there's no clear-cut answer. It depends, but it's usually going to be an analysis of all of the applicable laws, taking into account whose data it is, where they reside, where the data's stored, and all those sorts of things. So I don't know if that answers the question, but it's complicated.
So the other question that I wanted to ask now, before you move on, and Bhavesh asked this really early, does a lawyer need to sit in while writing these policies?
Generally not the policies if there's no specific legal element. So if the policy is just a matter of stuff like, thou shalt not surf the web and download illegal copies of, I mean, they may get involved if someone does do that. So they may get involved in the event that someone does download some bootleg copy of, I don't know, Avengers. I don't know. Then they may get involved, but in the policy writing, no. Having said that, in some specific policies, for example, a privacy policy, a legal professional may get involved. Or one where there may be a bit of gray area around whether can we actually do that. And so that happens sometimes to do with, monitoring of employees and things like that. And so in those instances, it may be worthwhile just making sure that whatever is being done is legal. But generally, if it's just a general like acceptable use, or you must use corporate devices for accessing email and stuff like that, then generally not.
Okay, that makes sense. And while you have just one more drink of water, I'm sure, I'm just going to remind everyone we have a robust comment section. It's really exciting. But also, if you have any questions for George throughout the thing, put them in the question and answer section. And if hopefully we get time for them, I'll try to ask as many questions as possible. But there's only so much time in the evening.
Yeah, we
I'll let
could.
George get back to it.
Oh, good. Thank you. All right. So change management. Change management. So what is change management? Change management, I'm just going to read it, is a systematic approach that manages all changes made to a product or system. And the idea is it's a couple things, but to me, it really is about risk management. So it's about making sure that you're not creating risk and you're not creating things like outage. And it says here, negatively impacting security, availability, or performance. And so changes need to be handled properly. Don't get me wrong, I've been in many organizations in the past that, whether I've been a consultant or whether I've been in them, where there's that, well, we call it the cowboy approach, right? Just kind of woo, just kind of do whatever. That's usually when stuff goes wrong. And when it does go wrong, it can be hard to undo because it hasn't been planned properly. And usually there's going to be some impact where someone's going to get upset because, someone has made a change, knocked out a system, and when that's happened, maybe there were still like too many people online trying to do work and now they can't do work and stuff like that. So that's why there's this concept of a change management program where stakeholder input, and then there's a change review board. So change review board, sometimes called a change advisory board or CAB. So I don't know if anyone's familiar with the term CAB. But the key thing here is to plan the change. So raising a change request, having the appropriate elements, and then including considerations like, the maintenance window. So when can the change be done? What is the impact? And then building out those, those plans. So how is the change going to be done? What's that sort of step by step? And I mean, it's probably not going to be granular, but for example, stand up server, do this, turn this off. And then if it all goes horribly wrong, how are we going to undo it? So planning that out as the back out plan. And then how are you going to test it? So once it's done, how are you going to test it? Is it like logging in? Yep, I can log in, everything's fine. Is it accessing a website? Yep, website's up, everything's fine. How is that test done? And if that test fails, then do we need to initiate a backup plan? So doing that is really important. The other thing is around standard operating procedures. So there may be standard operating procedures to do the change, but there also may be the requirement to update standard operating procedures. So when a change is implemented, if it affects some piece of documentation, then that may also need to be changed as well. And there are different types of changes. There are standard changes. So there's the concept of a standard change, which is where a change is effectively pre-approved. And so that's typically going to be something fairly almost BAU. It's like a business as usual change. So maybe that is, I'm trying to think of what a standard, I don't have a suggestion of what a standard change might be. Um, I don't know, let's say resetting a password is probably not a standard change, but um, I don't know, adding a system to the domain might be a standard change. It doesn't require approval, but maybe it needs to be recorded somewhere. But it wouldn't typically go to CAB. Then you just get a normal kind of change, which is your usual day-to-day change, and then you may have emergency changes. So if something critical happens and it needs to be fixed, then that may need to be raised. It needs to obviously be documented, have all these same things, but maybe it can't wait till the next change review board meeting. And so there's a sort of side channel to deal with that. Maybe it's the head of CAB that can approve it with a couple other stakeholders. So there's different ways to do that. Um, so yeah, different types of change requests. One thing that's also mentioned in the Security Plus material is allowed and blocked changes. And they look at the whole allow and deny list thing, which I thought was interesting. So allow and deny lists, they help with change management because what they can do is they can block software, hardware, and specific change types, or they can allow it. And so you can see here, it says, description block virtual box manager executable. This almost feels a little bit like app control, which for anyone that's familiar with the Essential 8, so in Australia, we have the ACC Essential 8, app control appears on there. And what this does is actually, there's a good idea of a standard change is implementing a piece of software, right? Probably doesn't need a whole change review board to implement a piece of software on a desktop. And the reason I then talk about this is because, things like block changes would prevent things like shadow IT or copyright licensing breaches, etc. And so these restricted activities, they refer to actions or changes that require additional scrutiny, stricter controls, or a higher level of approval or authorization because of the impact that they may have on systems. Perhaps it's the sensitivity of the data or it's a regulatory compliance issue. So yeah, just thinking about some of those allowed and block changes. And then, we're talking about impact and what the impact of change has, need to be concerned with things like restarts, dependencies, and downtime. So does a system need to get rebooted? I mean, evidently that would probably lead to downtime, but, is that happening at a time that is appropriate? So in other words, it wouldn't be a good idea to do a restart of a system, of a production system at 10 o'clock in the morning. Well, assuming that the entire user base is also working at 10 o'clock in the morning, that would probably be very, very bad. So often, those things will happen at 3 o'clock in the morning when everyone is soundly asleep, except for the person that has to restart the system. And then, what are the dependencies? So, often we see situations where a change is made and there's for example, a legacy system and it gets knocked offline because the change that has occurred isn't supported by the legacy system, and so have those things been considered as well. The idea here is really to minimize those disruptions, and make sure that everybody's informed of the change and the risks are managed. And then we have documentation and version controls. As I said before, making sure this stuff is documented, making sure those procedures are documented, are diagrams up to date. Is there a record of these changes? Again, this is usually through the change and control process. Are there any, when we talk about policies, going back to policies, there's always this concept of when should a policy be reviewed. Again, it depends organization to organization. The guidance I would typically give is at least annually or when significant change occurs. So in this sort of situation, if a significant change occurs, it may trigger an update to some document or a policy or something like that. Or a standard or a procedure. So just, yeah, bear in mind that those sorts of things can happen. All right. Compliance and operational security. I'm going to keep going because I'm literally only halfway through the deck, but we are over half time. We can go a little bit over the right, maybe.
We can. I'm sure everyone really wants us to stay very late, obviously.
Not too late. Maybe a little bit, little bit.
Only a little bit.
But it
I
will be
trust you,
recorded,
George.
right? So if you do, unfortunately, have to leave us, you can go back and watch like the last bit. Automation and security. Sorry, automation and orchestration. I was just reading two different lines at once. Um, so automation and scripting is something that is, I think, it's been around forever. I mean, I remember writing batch files for stuff 20 years ago, which is kind of scary now I think about it. And it says critical tool in modern IT operations. I mean, it's been a critical tool as long as I can remember, and I've been in this industry for, yeah, I lost count. I don't know, 25 years. Oh God. Anyway, and so what this does is it really helps to, well, as it says here, streamline processes, improve efficiencies, and things like that. So think, PowerShell, batch files. There's also specific automation tools that could do that. I think one thing to note though is that things like scripts can be a double-edged sword. So, the same power that can be wielded from a script can also result in widespread damage if not used properly, or if there's some sort of vulnerability with it. I think, there's definitely been in my career, there's been moments where I'm like, oh my God, hang on a minute. Oh, did I just actually do something? But then I was like, oh no, it's all fine. But, there's been those panic moments where you're like, you've tested it, tested it, tested it, and you're like, wait, this doesn't quite look right. But, so again, very important testing and change management. But yeah, as I said, very, very powerful. So if I look at scripting, automation, and I also mentor IT 527. Is it an E? Is that one an E?
That one's an E. Everything's an E except for ITI 581.
See, I got tricked. So IT 527, which is the server administration subject, part of that is actually scripting. So it's about using a scripting tool to import accounts from an input file. So rather than going through one at a time and going new user account, blah, name, blah, email address, password, etc., it's done in bulk. And so in very, very large environments, that's going to be very, very useful because who wants to do that one at a time. So, it's a very critical thing. It helps prevent, errors. It speeds things up. So yes. I mean, there are other examples of automation scripting, but those are the ones that come to mind. If I look at, yeah, so mitigating operator fatigue. How many times am I going to right click new account, right click new account, right click new account, come up with a random password? going to get bored of that pretty quickly. One thing I will say, because I've spent, some of my life as well as an auditor, and doing audits for, um, well, regulated organizations and things like that, and assurance activities. There's a concept of manual versus automated controls as well. And so those that are automated tend to be under less scrutiny because there's less room for error by leveraging automation. So it makes life easier, everything's better, rather than doing things one at a time. And things will be more consistent as well. So yeah, and we will talk about maybe some of the threat stuff in a later module, but there's also the orchestration stuff that can happen with response to security incidents. So, for example, you probably may have heard, you may have heard of the concept of SOAR, SOAR. What that does is it orchestrates response to an incident. So, for example, if a security information event monitoring system detects that an incident has happened, it can trigger an orchestration event, which basically says, okay, I see this type of event. These are the steps that I should automatically do, e.g., lock the account out, alert somebody, do this, do that, do this. So that's other ways to orchestrate it. So it doesn't require an individual to go, okay, what do I do now? So, where it's almost like it's running a playbook for certain type of events. Now that's obviously not going to be useful in every single scenario, but it may be for some of those very, very common ones. For example, maybe there's a anomalous detection of a login that's occurred in a place that maybe is of higher risk. Or someone logged in Melbourne and they're saying they're logging in London and it's only been like 5 minutes. In other words, impossible travel. We should orchestrate a response to that. So those are ways to automate it rather than sending an alert to an admin who then goes, oh, I need to do something about that. So, that can really also help manage risk and respond to incidents. Cool. I'm going to pause for another second while I have another sip of water, and then we'll get on to classification and compliance.
I should learn to work on my banter game so that I can have something to say while you have a sip of water.
Any questions or we're good?
We've got lots of questions. I don't know if you want to go over some of them now or
Oh, I'll click the button. All right.
we've got so many questions.
Okay. Um, okay. What is the difference between disaster recovery and incident response? And then I see there's one that says, what is disaster recovery? So, disaster recovery is kind of exactly that. It's recovering from when there's a disaster. I know I just reworded the same two words, but for example, if a critical system goes out or data is destroyed or something that would adversely affect the organization occurs, disaster recovery is about recovering from that. So, we think about, a couple of web servers, for example, and say, I don't know, catches fire. How are you going to recover? That's disaster recovery, or DR. You probably heard of the acronym DR. Incident response is tied into disaster recovery. That's about the actual response. So it may not always be a disaster recovery scenario. So an incident is anything that is adverse that has been detected, and that may not necessarily be a disaster, like it could be a suspected data breach. So I always say that, let's see if I can get this right. Um, uh, so data breaches, so there are incidents and then there are data breaches. And so a data breach will always be an incident, but an incident will not always be a data breach. And it's the same with disaster recovery, right? So it may not always need disaster recovery. So there may be an incident and it may need disaster recovery, but it may not. But, if disaster recovery is required, that means that an incident has occurred. So yeah, just a comment there, not every incident. Well, no, not quite, but so yeah, that's kind of how that sits. Um, who writes these policies? Well, it depends. So typically, if an owner is in the policy, if they've all left, well, then that's an issue because someone really needs to review that. And typically, it's going to be depending on who it applies to. It sounds like you need to look for new policy owners. If it's an information security policy, it's typically going to be a CISO or so Chief Information Security Officer. We talked about those roles last week. It could even be further up, could be, a Chief Information Officer or something like that. So you need to identify who the owner is. And then they will typically delegate that to somebody to say, okay, you need to go and rewrite those policies. Often organizations get consultants to come in and help rewrite policies or update policies. Certainly if a policy is over, is 3 years old, it's probably due for an update. But yeah, I think it's about identifying who the owner is and then working out who then needs to help update that. But yeah, I mean, unfortunately, if those folks have left, who's replaced them? So, what are some policies you've seen on the usage of AI tools nowadays, chatbots? Yeah. So one that I've authored was the use of emerging technologies. That's one example. And so the use of emerging technologies has provided, and I've had to write the thing from scratch because there wasn't really anything about that that was out there, but it does take into account things like the use of sensitive data and prohibiting the use of sensitive data going to unsanctioned platforms and so forth. So a lot of the time, the policy will be driven around risk. So what is the risk, and then how do we mitigate that risk, and then use a policy, e.g., administrative control, to help mitigate that. And then you can overlay technical controls to enforce that policy. But yeah, that's one of the examples that I've used. All right, I should probably keep going. Data classification and compliance. Oof, do a lot of that. All right. So data types, categorizing or classifying data based on its inherent characteristics, structure, and intended use. And so we have regulated data. So what is regulated data? Personal information is regulated data. Um, you know, well, actually, that's probably the big one, to be honest. Trade secrets, intellectual property, legal and financial data, and yes, there are many others. I've just gone through a massive data discovery exercise where I've identified the data types that we have and applied a classification, which is the next slide, actually, which then leads into how is that information protected and so forth. So, there are different data types, as I said, and there are different reasons for that. So a lot of the time you'll see things like intellectual property and trade secrets kind of combined as a particular data classification. You'll see regulated data may also be rolled up into that. You'll also have other data types like marketing data and things like that that may be considered less sensitive or public data. And this is where classification comes into it. So if you think about these different data types, and then think about how you will identify the sensitivity of that data, this is where classifications will come in. And so classifications are designed to do or to identify the sensitivity of the information, but also designed to help protect the information. And so what you've got when you talk about data classification is, you can see here, label confidential. And so if we think about, and you've probably seen these before, but you'll have, and organizations will differ on the classifications that they have, but typically what you'll see is you'll see at least a confidential or some variation of confidential information or confidential classification. You'll often see a public version. So for example, for public consumption. And then, you may see a more sensitive one. So something like confidential and then restricted and then, public, and then you may see an internal as an example, but it varies from organization to organization. Governments, on the other hand, will have very specific ones that are used government wide. So if we look at Australia, you'll see things like, what do you call it? Top secret, secret, protected, official, unofficial, and then you'll have like sub classifications, so official, sensitive, official, privileged, and those sorts of things. But again, it's up to an organization how they do that. Some will have 4 classifications, some will have 3, some will have 2. I've seen organizations that specifically label PI. I mean, that you could do that, or it could be bundled up with, restricted information. But again, what the idea here is that when you've got information like PI or like trade secrets, you know that that's going to be highly, highly sensitive. So you should label it according or classify it according to its sensitivity. And so by doing that, it then provides a basis for what controls need to be applied. So if I look at the example of restricted information, you could say if it is restricted, then you should be doing encryption at rest, encryption in transit, and that would comply with the standards that you've defined, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of how that connects together. All right, I should hurry up. So data sovereignty, someone asked the question before around data, did I? Someone did, I'm sure. Data sovereignty, and they did, and geographical questions. So what is data sovereignty? So this is the legal jurisdiction that restricts processing and storage of data systems that do not physically reside within that jurisdiction. So this is around understanding where your data is located. So this was the question from before. So if your data is located in the US, then it may be subject to US laws and regulations, irrespective of whether the data is for an organization that is based in a completely different country, or the information of the people that are contained, if there's PI in there, are based in a different country. So this is where data sovereignty comes in, and this is why it's really important to understand what the implications are. And then there's other stuff around geographical considerations. So data remaining within a designated boundary. So for example, things like geolocking, is that what I'm looking for? So, if the data, say, is in Australia and you don't want it to be able to be accessed from, I don't know, um, Eastern Europe, for example, you could put controls in to restrict the accessibility of that information from a certain geographic region. And it's very common for example, single sign-on providers will be able to detect where a login is coming from. And so this happened to me. I was at one of my previous roles, we only allowed login to the systems from within Australia. And I went on holidays to Hawaii, and I realized I'd forgotten to do something. And so I tried to log in and I couldn't. And it was very annoying. But I was like, okay, well, cool. I mean, I wrote that policy, so I kind of just shot myself in the foot. Um, so, oh well, I guess I can enjoy my holiday. So, that's what those geographical considerations are. So, yeah, important to be across those. Privacy, I'm going to talk a little bit about privacy. So personally identifiable or sensitive information associated with an individual's personal, financial, or social identity. The definition varies depending on what jurisdiction you're in, but it is a very important thing for anyone that's been, across the news recently. You will have seen some of the very high profile privacy related uh, cases that are happening at the moment. There's a particular, for those that are in Australia, you probably know what I'm talking about. For those that are not, there's a very high profile breach that occurred, when was that? 2022 from memory. And the Privacy Commissioner, or in Australia, the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, is now seeking civil I guess, litigation against this particular organization. And there's been some pretty crazy numbers thrown out there, which highlight the importance of privacy. And so, in this particular instance, it's alleged that the privacy of, individuals was infringed upon. And so, I think what it's going to do is raise the further. I mean, privacy has always been important, but I think it's really driving home that this is a very important thing to control and to comply with. Which, for me, I'm pretty heavily in the privacy space, so I couldn't agree more. And so, and it says here there's rapidly evolving legal environment when it comes to privacy. Australia, for example, is currently going through Privacy Act reforms. So there's going to be a whole bunch of stuff. I think the first amendment to the bill is due to drop, or the next amendment to the bill is due to drop in August this year. So there's quite a lot going on. And it really focuses on the rights of individuals. And the EU, as an example, we've talked about GDPR, is probably what is considered, or what's considered the gold standard privacy law. I think they call it something else now, but when looking at how privacy laws should be, often the EU GDPR is taken as an example. And so this last thing here, where individuals have a right to access, correct, and request deletion of their privacy data, that sounds very GDPR-ish to me, because they do have that right under GDPR. I think in Australia, it's not quite there yet, but it certainly looks like it's going that way. And certain other jurisdictions have also got a similar thing. So, for example, I believe the privacy legislation in the Philippines, in the UK, have certain rights like that. And someone feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but they all, when I read through them, they do sound very similar, and a lot of overlap with the GDPR requirements. Cute. And so here you'll see protecting privacy carries significant local, national, and global legal implications. This is what I was talking about before. And so it's really important that privacy is complied with. These roles and responsibilities, again, when you look at these sing to me GDPR, data controller, data processor. So the data controller is the organization that, or the controller that has been, who is responsible for the personal information. And if they then use another party, for example, so let's use the example of I, as an organization, collect information from customers for whatever purpose, for whatever legitimate purpose, and I then put that information into a cloud platform. I am the controller, the cloud platform is the processor, and there are requirements for both of those to do that. The data subject is the, in the individual, or the person that is that the information belongs to. Again, very GDPR, the right to be forgotten. So this is about where there's no sort of legitimate reason to keep something. So for example, if there's a legal requirement to keep it, then, I think there's some bits around, you can't just forget that. But the EU persons have the right to request that their information be removed. That's under certain circumstances, kind of what I was getting at. And there's also requirements around detailed records and information around personal information, and understanding what personal information people hold. Again, this is all, just as a hint, this is all very GDPR related information. And then privacy breaches. So the definition of a breach could be quite narrow. And it's really important to, review legislation and determine precise requirements. So organizations can result in, if a breach does occur, and again, we're seeing this right now in Australia: reputation damage, identity theft, fines, intellectual property theft. So these are all potential consequences of a breach, whether it be a privacy or a data breach. And there may be notification requirements. So again, in Australia, there is the notifiable data breach scheme that came in 2018 that says that in the event that a breach of personal information occurs for, organizations that are covered by the Privacy Act, and the breach results in serious harm, and there's some sort of guidance on what that means, then a notification is required. So that individual needs to be notified, the Privacy Commission needs to be notified, etc. So again, this will feed back into potential reputational damage and things like that. We're almost there. Compliance. So compliance is around adherence to security standards, regulation, policies, and best practices. So all that stuff we've talked about from prior to this point. Compliance is about making sure that it is complied with, and you'll see things like GRC functions, governance, risk, and compliance functions. So that's one part of it. The second part is around more of the legal piece. So here we talk about legal and regulatory compliance, so complying with Privacy Act, complying with EU GDPR. Software licensing would be complying with things like intellectual property compliance and making sure that you've got the right number of licenses that you purchased for the number of folks that have it installed, for example. And then contractual compliance would be complying with any contracts that have been entered into, which kind of ties a little bit back into legal. And then we've got monitoring and reporting. And so this goes back into compliance again. So evaluating compliance, reporting on it. Often this will have to get reported back to risk and compliance committees and things like that. So I won't talk more about that. I feel that's fairly self-explanatory. Almost there. I think this is the second last slide. All right. So data protection and data loss prevention, or sometimes it's known as data leakage prevention, but we'll call it data loss prevention for the purposes of Security Plus. And so here you've got different protections required for each state. So data at rest is data that is stored. So if it's sitting on storage, hard disk, USB stick, solid state disk, that's data, even within a database, that is data at rest. Data in motion, sometimes called data in transit, is as it is moving. So if you're transmitting data over the internet, that is data in motion. If you're copying it between two servers, that is data in motion. And then data in use, also sometimes called data in process, is data as it's being processed. So while it's being run, so say it's in a database, it gets transmitted to an application. So it's gone from rest to in motion. Now it's in the application and the application is doing something with it. That's data in use. And so there are different methods that are required, different protections that are required to do that. So again, you'll see, and we will talk about the different types of encryption in one of the later weeks. I think it's maybe week 4. But yeah, there are different ways that need to be applied. Data loss prevention is about taking the data type, taking the classification, and enforcing rules. And the rules will prevent the loss or leakage of information. So for example, if I have a confidential document and it says that, if I have an internal document that is only allowed to be used internally and I try and email it out, if I have a DLP rule that says I can't do that, that is it doing its job, right? So it's about stopping the loss or leakage of information that is unauthorized. So, and that could be a DLP client, it could be the disabling of USB ports, it could be network-based DLP, so it's happening through network versus on the endpoint. And you can see here in the Microsoft Security and Compliance Center, or Purview, I think it is now, there's a policy there that basically says if you are it's going to detect, so that's a sensitive data type, detecting US Social Security number, US UK passport number, individual taxpayer number, then detect that it is shared with people outside the organization. And if you continue going through that, it'll say, what do you want to do? Do you want to alert someone? Do you want to block it? That's enforcing a DLP rule. Cool. All right. That is the end of the content. But next week, we're going to go a little bit more into lab land, and we're going to look at parrot security. So next week, we're looking at threats and vulnerabilities and things like that. For anyone that wants to follow along, you can download parrot security from the website. Obviously, because this is kind of one way, I can't really help you install ParrotSec, but there's a VM in there that you can run. And maybe it's worthwhile if you've got any like major issues, you could probably pop it into the forum and
Maybe
try and
maybe
get.
we create a specific forum for people with issues, and hopefully we can get some help in there. Where there's a lot of people here, some
Yeah,
of them will want to help.
hopefully, yeah. And look, I will go through it. And yeah, hopefully, if one person has an issue, and then another person has the same issue, and then another person has the same issue, then that'll be a bit easier. It should be pretty straightforward. It's pretty easy to spin up. So if anyone wants to follow along, we could do that. Otherwise, I'll obviously be going through it. So we'll get a little bit more hands-on next week.
Great. Hopefully, the forum might be like Reddit back in the old days where they answer a question pretty quickly instead of just a lot of people having the same problem.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Me too. I've got this problem.
Alrighty then. Before you get to the questions, I'm just going to quickly take 2 minutes and spruik a little bit about our courses. We are IT Masters. We're an online education provider. We do have courses based on most of the short courses, the free short courses that will continue to be free and easy to access. Uh, Available for accredited courses with Charles Sturt University. If you want to check out our website, we also have a free information session next Tuesday night about anyone who wants to find out more information about our courses and the Commonwealth supported places available for Australian citizens and residents so that they can get one of our grad certs for a considerably cheaper price. And you probably, if you've signed up for this course, you've received emails about that, but you might want more information. So if you want to check out the IT Masters website, great. And there's links on every email we send you. So feel free to check us out if you're interested in studying more and getting a qualification that might help you, get further in your career or just get you more information. Anyway, I'm going to pass back to George. We've got a lot of questions here, and I am not an expert at finding out what the questions are that I think George wants to talk about. This is not my area of expertise.
That's right. I'll plug a few out. So I talked about PowerShell scripts, and there's the question from Cam around given the prevalence of living off the land attacks, how can we prevent against these kind of attacks while enabling the use of standard tools? And look, again, I was saying to sometimes these kind of verge into a little bit of like almost consulting advice, but it's not. But and again, I think preventing, and I probably don't need to say this, complete prevention is very difficult. But I always talk about minimizing risk. And so in this instance, I think this is about, and ISO applies to this because I've had to do this, is around controlling access. So, things like least privilege. So if a threat actor gets access to a PowerShell, they can't run anything meaningful anyway is going to be something that's sort of a first piece there. The other thing that you can do, and by default, PowerShell, I can't remember exactly what setting it's set to, but there's execution policies. And so you can limit it to only scripts, for example, that are signed by trusted. I know we're starting to get into a bit more complex things, but if you've got scripts, you can digitally sign them with a trusted signer to say that these are the only scripts that can run. So it's really about control. It's about limiting who can run privileged actions. And it's about using things like role-based access controls to limit that, and about the use of things like digital signatures to try and reduce the capability for a threat actor to run a script or for someone to download and run a malicious script. So that's typically how I would attack it. I've also used certain app control tools. So there's an app control tool that I used in the past that would actually prevent that. And there's also EDR tools that will detect when, but again, it can't, I'll be completely honest, it can be a bit hit and miss. So yeah, that's usually how I would tackle that one. So I just click the answer live button.
You click it and then you unclick it once you've done the thing. Once you've,
Sorry.
I
I've
don't
done
really
that
know if it
before.
makes a difference when you've when you click it, but
Yeah.
it just shows it's been answered.
This is an easy one. This is the question from Vish asking, is this training covering course contents for CompTIA Sec plus 601 or 701? It is 701, so it is the newer content, not the 601 content, which I think the exam is pretty much finished in a week. So this is the new exam for 701. Click to there. There we go.
And as George said earlier, we are covering a lot of the content, but it's not possible to cover all of it in 4 1 hour or 1.5 hour, let's be honest, webinars. So we will hopefully cover as much as possible, and there will be links to other things.
Yep. The question is it, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, Sheba? Are standards derived from policies or is it the other way around? So it will typically start with policies. I have seen instances where people like kind of reverse engineer stuff, but you typically start with policies because policies are aligned to the business requirements. And then from the policy, so for example, there's no point putting a standard to say this is all the encryption stuff that we're going to do if your policy isn't going to say, and then you're going to encrypt stuff. So you start with why, what do we, the why. So what aligns with the business needs and goals. So thou shalt encrypt stuff, and then the standard then follows that, and then obviously the procedures and so forth. So you start that approach. So policies, standards, procedures. I'm not really sure about that. How to ensure encryption standards question. Um, if you're talking about what are the kind of, best practice encryption standards, to be honest, it's probably going to be a bit of a, do a bit of, it's probably going to be a research thing, look at what they are. I mean, I could probably rattle off a lot of them off the top of my head. Um, but I'm trying to think if there's some examples of what they are. For example, NIST may provide some details on that. I know that I use CIS. So CIS have a lot of information on best practice standards and benchmarks and things like that. I think some of it's paid, some of it's not. Have a look at that, see if there's anything useful there. I'd probably start with that. I've got a lot of questions. So the parrot thing, I'll pop that into, if we can create that, this is the one from, well, guessing that's not their name, anonymous attendee. Um, if you put that forum in there, I mean, the information will be on that link to get to ParrotSec, and it should say what the requirements are. But yeah, if we've got that sort of chat forum thing, discussion forum, I can put some information in that.
And we'll get Lily to make sure that forum is created.
Yeah. I typically use Security Edition. I would do Security Edition because it's going to be a security tool. So, yep. So there's a few questions about the edition. Oh, there's quite a few questions about the edition. Sorry, it is the security one. There we go. Let's clean up like four of them at once. Um, why do you think Australian organisations have a much harder time, especially due to events from recent years? Sorry, what was that referring to?
I don't remember. Sorry.
No, me neither. Um, don't know. Sorry, I don't know what the context of harder time is. You feel free to amend that. Can you amend stuff? Um, is CompTIA exam more focused on business security policy or technical knowledge or networks and cybersecurity? I think it's a bit of everything. So there'll be technical elements, there'll be governance elements. So the stuff that we're going through, as you probably worked out, is very it almost feels a bit like the CISSP exam. It's very kind of what do we call it? Mile wide, inch deep. There's a lot of content to cover. So it's probably not going to be focused on one of those areas specifically, rather it'll be across multiple areas. I think the one thing that I did mention before with for example, the legislation is there's not an expectation that you know every tenet of the legislation and legal requirements. Again, it's much more high level. Like you know that GDPR exists and vaguely what it does. You know and how it who it applies to. You know that there's PCI and what that is. You know about GLBA, those sorts of things, and NERC and so forth. But yeah, I think again, if you need to have that balance of a bit of technical, a bit of network, a bit of cyber, a bit of the fundamental stuff, a bit of the governance stuff, a bit of the data protection stuff. Yeah, it's quite broad. Oh, all right.
That's been quite a few questions, and it is now about 10 to 9. Do we have one more that we think might be a question to answer, or there are
Uh,
so many of them?
There's a lot of them. That person come back and answer that. No.
I love Zoom, but it doesn't have a very good question organizing tool.
Look, you may be able to do it in Kali. It does have many of the same tools. Obviously the lab will be in Parrot, so for the sake of tomato, tomato, or apples for apples. Um, yeah, but yes, theoretically same. Uh,
And remember, I don't know what question you're looking at, so if you want to read it out,
which one?
whichever question, if you're going to answer a question,
Oh,
maybe
yeah. So that was the Kali one. I don't know where it went. Oh, there. I'll just done. Uh, cool. So many. Are the change management programs captured in register similar to a register log? Change management programs, I typically find that, so this is the anonymous attendee 18807. Does that help? So if so change is captured in a particular type of program standard, yeah, yes. So to answer that, I typically see them captured as part of a ITSM. So if there's an IT service management system, often you'll see change management captured in there. So, records of the change. So there'll be a change request number, there'll be who the initiator is, and all those sorts of things, and the details. They will typically be captured in that system. In the absence of that system, because yes, I get it, ITSM is not going to be something that's typically free. Maybe there is a free one, but something like a Excel. I mean, Excel is that's like my favorite tool. It's not, but I use it for pretty much everything. Um, is another way to do it. So usually that would be in combination with a form. So the form would capture those details that we talked about before. So what is the change? When is it scheduled for? What is the roll, the impact, the rollback plan, the testing plan, and then the results of that may be captured in a form, and maybe that's a Word document. Again, it's often if you've got like an ITSM, like a ServiceNow or something like that, it's a form that's built into there and it's saved as a record. But in the absence of that, it could easily be done using, your typical spreadsheet plus Word doc, or you could do two separate spreadsheets. Yeah, it just depends. All right.
All right, that's been a really informative session. I'm not sure if you had any other questions you desperately wanted to answer, but will have a section on the forum so that people can put these questions in there. And our amazing group of attendees and experts who are coming to these webinars can help with the questions, because I do believe a lot of people in the audience have the answers here. I've seen in the chat where people put questions in there and definitely have the answers to it. Thank you so much for everyone attending. Thank you so much for George for presenting. It's been very interesting to find out about these things. And definitely thank you for Lily for doing the admin work here. Have we got any leftover steps here?
Leftover
I
what?
should put, uh, you know, anything else to say before we
No,
end the session?
thank you. No, no, all good. No, so, yeah, thanks for coming along and listen to me try and get through as much as I can in the time. I hope you found that helpful and useful, and yeah, look forward to seeing you next week. And as I said, we'll play a little bit more in a lab, and we can do something besides just watching me go through PowerPoints.
That sounds pretty exciting. I like the idea of something a little bit different.
Yeah.
So
May the
I'll see
demo
you all
gods be
next
with
week.
me.
But also, does everything go to plan anytime you do a demo? Does that ever work?
Yeah, it's always been fine. Yeah,
It's never failed.
touch
All right,
wood.
great.
No, once it did, but I'm not. Yeah, that I'll talk to you about that one. So I'm not sharing that.
Maybe we'll do a little practice session. Who knows?
Yeah.
Um, Thank you, everyone, and everyone who's pointed out that we've been jinxed now.
Yeah, I
Um,
know. I touched wood. Hope that works.
we'll see you next week, where surely, knock on wood, nothing fails.
Exactly.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone, for
everybody.
attending, and put your questions into the learn.itmasters.edu.au site, and we'll see you soon.
Have a good day, evening, wherever you are. All right. Bye.